Hi Overthinkers, welcome to another video in this series where David and I talk about a philosophical text. I'm co-host of Overthink podcast and this YouTube channel, Ellie Anderson.
And I'm David Peña-Guzmán.
And today we're going to be talking about Maurice Merleau-Ponty's essay, The Philosopher and His Shadow, which is, in the book Signs. Maurice Merleau-Ponty is a very well-known 20th century French philosopher in the tradition of phenomenology, who's known for his insights on embodiment, intersubjectivity, and more. David, this essay, I think, is a favorite among people who work on Merleau-Ponty, and so I'm excited to talk about it with you today. Where do you want to start?
So the article is called The Philosopher and His Shadow, and the philosopher in question is not Merleau-Ponty himself, but rather Merleau-Ponty's teacher and mentor, Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. And I think a place to begin is with Husserl's relationship to Merleau-Ponty, or at least Merleau-Ponty's relationship to Husserl as it's articulated here.
Wait, did you say that Husserl's the founder of phenomenology?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, the father of phenomenology.
Well, founder.
And
father. We can say father, but I think founder is a clear, straightforward way of putting it.
He's the daddy of phenomenology. And in this essay, Merleau-Ponty begins by reflecting on what it means to be the founder of a tradition. And he is, of course, referring to Husserl. And he makes this really interesting argument in the opening lines of the essay, where he says, this is in fact the first line of the article, "Establishing a tradition means forgetting its origins," the aging Husserl used to say. "Precisely because we owe so much to tradition, we are in no position to see just what belongs to it." And that allows Merleau-Ponty to suggest that when a thinker instantiates or inaugurates a tradition, they obviously carry responsibility for what that tradition becomes as a result of their work. But he also believes that a thinker will always create a field of possibility in the act of creating a system of thought that is not for them to control or for them to fill out, but rather for their descendants. And so that's how I interpret the reference to shadow in the beginning. That in the same way in which I cast a shadow that I cannot control, that I cannot evade, and that I cannot cut off from me. So too, as a thinker, in my work, I create these shadows that maybe I cannot directly see and I cannot directly control, but that open up fields of possibility for thinkers down the road.
Yeah, and Husserl was well known for being a mentor and for building up a school around him. Some of his students stayed as a kind of Husserl acolyte, including people like Edith Stein, well-known philosopher who develops a theory of empathy, and Merleau-Ponty talks quite a bit about empathy in this essay in the German word Einfühlung. But even those philosophers were often working with Husserl and pushing Husserl on certain things. He was very collaborative with them. And then there are other students of Husserl's who ended up sort of breaking with Husserl, Heidegger most famously, and some of that had to do with the fact that Husserl was Jewish and Heidegger became a Nazi. But even before that, the political events of the 1930s, Heidegger had decided to sort of go his own way. And Merleau-Ponty has a different relationship to Husserl than the people who actually knew him, because you described Husserl as a teacher and mentor of Merleau-Ponty. And I just want to clarify that Merleau-Ponty, as he talks about in this essay, didn't actually know Husserl personally. He studied at the Husserl archives, but he was not, he didn't meet Husserl. And so to call him a teacher and mentor, I think is right, but in the sort of sense that, Merleau-Ponty is using here of the inauguration of a tradition. Like, he's writing in the tradition of Husserl. And there are a few things...
Yeah, in the same way that Merleau-Ponty is our teacher and mentor.
Yeah.
We don't know him personally.
I know. I felt the need to really clarify that, because otherwise people are going to be like, Husserl taught Merleau-Ponty, his close personal friend and mentee. Not the case. But I think... there are a few ways that he's pushing the tradition past Husserl in this essay, and I think actually getting into the content of those is where I'd really like to stay in our conversation today, so that this conversation is interesting and accessible for those who aren't super familiar with Husserl's work.
Yeah, and of course, the figure of Husserl in this text appears on the one hand as a foil for Merleau-Ponty to present essentially his theory of intersubjectivity, of empathy, of embodiment, and of nature, but it also appears as an opportunity for Merleau-Ponty to reflect on what it means to be a philosopher, period. And the reason why I wanted to begin and stay for a hot second with this notion of the shadow is because the notion of the shadow is not just a term that Merleau-Ponty is using for talking about a thinker's relationship to their work. It's, I think, a central phenomenological category that he also uses for thinking about the world of perception. Because what he says about Husserl and Husserlianism in the opening couple of pages of this essay is that there is an unthought of element in Husserl's work. And it's an unthought of element that it is our task as Husserl acolytes or as Husserl followers or as people interested in phenomenology to rediscover. And what's interesting about this notion of an unthought of element is that that unthought of element is not simply something that Husserl didn't think about. Like, it's not a point that was missed by Husserl by accident or by oversight. Rather, it's something that is already there germinating in Husserl's thinking that may move in a direction counter to Husserl's own intentions in some cases, or that introduces a certain ambiguity into Husserl's work that he says it is our task to tarry with. And so that unthought of element, I think, is important to underscore because it suggests that a philosopher's of their work will push in different directions, which is why he says with Husserl, about many of the topics that are going to be discussed and that we'll talk about in a minute, you see Husserl moving in two directions simultaneously, and he couldn't quite resolve that tension on his own. But the contradiction is in part there because it's part of the subject matter, even though maybe Husserl thought he had resolved the issue one way or the other.
Yeah, okay, so let's get into this. And I want to make a friendly suggestion, which is that we use the word Husserl as minimally as possible, maybe not even again, just because I worry that people who aren't familiar with his work are hearing this, are hearing our repetition of his name over and over again and getting alienated by the discussion. So I want those who aren't familiar with this work to be able to, I think, access this text of Merleau-Ponty's without that sort of background and think about, hopefully for those who have read this text to be able to understand it maybe a bit more deeply, and for those who haven't read this text to maybe want to read it. So I think one way of putting this for me, there's a lot of interventions that Merleau-Ponty's making here, but one of them is in the concept of intentionality of consciousness. One of phenomenology's core claims is that consciousness is intentional, and if you've listened to some of our podcast episodes and or watched more of our videos, you probably are already familiar with this, or you might know it from your own studies. But just to quickly state, the intentionality of consciousness, that doesn't mean that consciousness is deliberate or voluntary. It means that consciousness is always toward something, usually toward an object. There's a relationality of consciousness that's core to what makes consciousness consciousness. And this often gets articulated in terms of the difference between subject and object, right? The intentionality of consciousness refers to the subject, and the thing that consciousness is oriented toward refers to the object. And Merleau-Ponty is often known as a thinker who tries to destabilize the subject-object distinction, but one thing you see him do in this essay is say that's not because it's wrong to think about consciousness in terms of a subject and object. It's rather that the relation between a subject and object is derivative. It comes secondarily to our original immersion in the world. Consciousness is fundamentally embodied, and we can see consciousness's own relationship to itself on a bodily level, even through the fact of one of my hands touching the other. And this idea of the two hands touching is a really famous example that first comes up in, sorry, I'm going to say it, Husserl, but then Merleau-Ponty.
You broke your own rule. I'm over here stressing about not saying Husserl, and here we go.
But it's an example that first comes up in his work and then ultimately becomes, for Merleau-Ponty, a way of describing how a consciousness, rather than needing to connect in some external way to a world, is always already embedded in the world. I don't want you to stress about this. I just wanted to really make sure that we're gonna, be able to
talk about
the substance. First and foremost.
Although in my defense, this essay is a reading of Husserl from top to bottom, so we cannot avoid talking about Husserl.
Yeah, I just don't think that the needs necessarily to be like front loaded.
Well, I think we disagree about this because the shadow in question is Husserl's shadow.
Okay,
so maybe we'll get to that a little bit more. But yes, there's a lot here that tells us more about Merleau-Ponty than about Husserl.
And so that's about consciousness, right? It's not fundamentally about like this figure. I think it's about the ideas that are at work.
Yeah, of course. And so, you're right to begin here with this notion of intentionality, that consciousness is always consciousness of, and that means that there is always an intentional object that is the correlate of an act of consciousness, right? I think about something, or I perceive something. In the case of phenomenology, we might want to keep it at the level of perception for now. And Merleau-Ponty begins by suggesting that one of the ways in which the H word...
No, it's fine, you can say it. I just wanted to minimize.
Yes. One of the ways in which Husserl's work has been read, and he says there are very good reasons for thinking this way, is that Husserl has been read as proposing precisely that subject-object framework as a starting point of phenomenology. Because in Husserlian phenomenology, as a matter of method, you have these reductions that you go through, including what is known as the eidetic reduction. There's the reduction of the natural attitude, where you sort of start relating to objects not as real entities that exist in the world, but rather as appearances. So I start attending to the book not as a material object with a certain ontological status, but as something that appears to me. And according to Husserl, once we do that, we liberate a realm of reality or a realm of appearance that philosophers have not thought about, at least not rigorously, for a long time. And so this is the starting point of Husserlian phenomenology, that you attend to what is sometimes called the immanence of consciousness, to consciousness as a field of manifestation and appearance. But that does seem to presuppose that act-object, subject-object dichotomy. And so what Merleau-Ponty will try to do in this text, and this is why I do think we need to keep in mind the relationship to the founding figure, is he's trying to say that even if Husserl moves in this direction of subject-object intentionality, there are passages, important passages in Husserl, including full-blown description of phenomena that push in the other direction. And that's Husserl's shadow that follows him.
And tell us about that other direction, because this is what I mean by really wanting to get into the substance. Like, what is this other direction that you see at work here?
So great. This is where we can start, for instance, talking about the hands that touch one another, because one of the ways in which people think about consciousness is, of course, in terms of reflexivity, right? The turning of the mind upon itself. It's something that we have talked about in various places in our podcast, in our YouTube channel. And according to Merleau-Ponty, that reflexivity is something that Husserl recognized can be achieved not at the level of consciousness, but at the level of the body. And so this is where that example of when I touch my hands, when my right hand touches my left hand, it is incorrect and it's unjust to the facts of experience to say that that experience is similar to the experience of touching some inanimate object. Why? Because when I touch an inanimate object, there is a subject-object structure that illuminates the experience. When I touch my other hand, the other hand is an object that is touched, but because it is also an organ of sensibility, it is also touching my hand that touches it. And so it creates a reflexivity of the touching being touched and vice versa. And so at the level of the body, you see that reflexivity taking place at a pre-theoretical or pre-conscious level. And so that allows Husserl to say one of the Husserlian discussions that pull us away from that let's say, cognitive-centric or thetic-centric understanding of human existence and human experience is Husserl's description of embodiment.
Mm-hmm. And I think we need to talk about the implications that this idea has for how we relate to other people, because Merleau-Ponty's claim here is that reflexivity on an embodied level of consciousness shows that we are, to go back to a point I made earlier, embedded in the world. And it also means that for him, there is no problem of other minds. And this is something that Merleau-Ponty also picks up on elsewhere in his work, including in his most famous book, The Phenomenology of Perception. Merleau-Ponty thinks that all the hand-wringing that philosophers do over how can we possibly know that another person has a mind, what if I'm the only mind in the world, the view of solipsism, is really misguided, because we can already tell through perception that other minds exist, because other minds are not kind of these abstract ideal things existing apart from materiality. They are material. But he thinks that if we start from thinking, the problem of other minds is going to be intractable. And if you've seen my video on Sartre's theory of the look, you might hear some resonances here, because this is a point on which Merleau-Ponty and Sartre agree. They agree that if we try and understand that other people are consciousnesses through cognition or thinking, we will never be able to get there. The most that cognition can give us is the idea that it is probable that another person has a mind, because like me, they have a body, because like me, they act on the world. Instead, if we start from perception, Merleau-Ponty says, we can just already witness the being of other people, the consciousness of other people. And so he says, rather than thinking about, does that other person think like me? I can see that the other person sees. And that's all the evidence I need in order to know that there are other minds.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that when he talks about other minds, he uses the term anomalia.
Where is that?
So it is, for example, in page 168.
Okay.
There are other animalia and possibly other men. And so I found this interesting, that the problem of other minds is really not specific to our species. So he is talking about just other sentient beings that have consciousnesses of their own. And so it's just a more, let's say, broad articulation of the same problem. But what I wanted to indicate here is that for Merleau-Ponty, the example of the hands touching one another, part of the value of that illustration is that it tells us how we relate to our own body in such a way that it blurs the subject-object distinction. But then he says we extend that logic to our perception of others, right? So it's actually a direct connection between my hands touching one another and me and Ellie perceiving one another. And there's a quote here that I want to share that connects those two examples. It's 168. And he uses the term compressence, which he coins, to talk about that relationship of the hands touching one another. They are compressant to one another, rather than just existing at the same time. There's a deeper connection. And he says, my two hands coexist or are compressant because they are one single body's hands. The other person appears through an extension of this compressance. So it's the same phenomenon happening in both cases. He and I, or in this case, her and I, are like organs of a single intercorporeality. And then a couple of lines after that, what I perceive to begin with is a different sensibility, and only subsequently a man and a different thought. So when I perceive Ellie, I don't have to reason by analogy that she's like me because she performs the same mental operations or because she has the same anatomy. Rather, in the act of seeing and perceiving, I sense that she senses me. And so we are like two hands of a larger body, which he calls intercorporeality.
I also just want to clarify too, compresent isn't coined by Merleau-Ponty.
Oh, really?
It's Husserl. It's a Husserl quote.
Oh, you're right. Compresence.
But in any case, I think to follow up on your point.
Thanks for that.
This is one of the puzzling things, I think, about Merleau-Ponty's claim, because one way of putting it is that there's no difference in kind between how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to others. This has been a topic of interest to me for a very long time. I talked about this passage quite a bit in my dissertation back in the day. And I think, on the one hand, there's something really appealing about it, in the sense that so many of the discussions around the problem of other minds in philosophy are really, really misguided, and no wonder they don't lead to any solutions. Like thinking about the other in terms of analogy, or introjection is another term he uses here. But at the same time, there also feels like something weird about saying that my hands touching each other are like me relating to the other, because with my two hands touching each other, there's a reversibility at work. And there's not a reversibility at work when I'm relating to others. And you do see Merleau-Ponty acknowledge that in certain parts of this text as well, where he does say, like, we can't know others' thoughts, for instance, and others do have a private world. And this has always been something that I've struggled with in understanding his work, because of course there is an important insight into the fact that we're not all just like individual monads locked up in our own private spaces. But I wonder whether Merleau-Ponty is really able to hold on to the insight that there is still an important difference between my ability to not only know my own mind versus that of others, but also to feel myself, to perceive myself versus others.
Yeah, so I would say that, one way to possibly resolve that tension of the reversibility of the hands versus the non-reversibility of the case of intersubjectivity is that when he talks about the fact that I cannot know another person, there he's talking about the problems that we run into either when we begin from an attitude of solipsism, or when we begin to approach the problem of other minds from a purely thetic or cognitive perspective, because there's a question about having access to the mental states of others. And so he says, it's true that I cannot have that, but that's, I think, not the approach that he wants to take. And so when it comes to sensibility, I think there is that kind of reversibility, because I sense you sensing me, and I see you seeing me. Of course, the analogy kind of breaks down, because in the case of the hands, we relate to there being a meta subject that is above both hands. Whereas in the case of subjectivity and intersubjectivity, rather, you and I, when we perceive each other, it's not as if we then take a third bird's eye perspective where we become the hands of a larger body.
I think that's a really good point. This idea that reversibility when it comes to different people might end up presuming this third person perspective, which is precisely what Merleau-Ponty wants to get away from, or a bird's eye perspective. And let's do it. Here. Like, I can feel your hand right now. I can't feel you feeling my hand.
Really? But presumably, so this raises a question.
It's like how long do you the whole rest of the video?
But this raises the question of whether you holding my hand is identical to you holding like a mannequin's hand. Presumably there has to be a difference.
Yeah. No, you're right. There's totally difference. Like, I can feel,
Like, I moisturize. Mannequins don't.
You actually used my moisturizer this morning, 2 moisturizers, because you came to my house to record and you were like, do you have moisturizer? Okay, so, in this case, like, I can feel the warmth of your hand. I can certainly feel that you're animated. Like, you can move, etc.
Yes.
So it's totally different from touching this book, or something like that. We can also feel the apprehensiveness. Like, you and I have been friends for a very long time, so it doesn't feel uncomfortable to hold your hand. But there's a part of me that's like, oh, mine's probably going to get, like, sweaty if I keep holding it and stuff like that. So there's that sort of future orientation, too, whereas that doesn't happen with my own hands. I'm not, like, worrying about what you might think. But the fact that I'm worrying about what you might think of my hand holding, is my grip too hard, is my grip too soft, or my hand's going to start sweating, I think already reveals that the layer of cognition of me, like, not being able to get into your thoughts is is present, it's co-present with the feeling, etc. And so I think one thing that I worry about a little bit with Merleau-Ponty is in this primacy of perception, which I agree with Merleau-Ponty that perception is like the fundamental mental state, we might say, even though I don't think he would like that term mental state at all, but it's a fundamental mode of consciousness, we could say. That nonetheless, it's still deeply bound up with thinking in other mental states or modes of consciousness, such that there still is not a problem of other minds necessarily, but some division that we're incapable of overcoming. And I say this as somebody who used to agree with Merleau-Ponty that there isn't a difference between how we're relating to ourselves and other people, and now has come to conclude, no, there are some ways that it is really importantly different.
So this is right, and it comes up in page 172 in a different way, because there Merleau-Ponty is talking about how my experience of other people can never really exhaust them. So yeah, I cannot have an experience of you in the same way that my experience of my hand is just mine.
Yeah.
And the reason that he gives there, and again, he's talking about Anomalia, which I'm just interested in. Yeah. But he says, when I encounter another person, even if I do have this semi-reversible relationship where we're part of this larger web of fleshy intercorporeality, the fact of the matter remains that those other subjects, and this is the phrase that I marked, enclose subjectivities. Yeah. So there's a subjectivity there that I really cannot experience unfiltered. Yeah. And there's always a limit to my access to it. Yeah. And he says, absolutely present beings have a wake of the negative.
Yes, I love that line. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, actually. And I think this can maybe be a closing point for us, is precisely this idea that the presence of another being also involves this absence. Although, yeah, I mean, there's no reason for me to extrapolate it on it, because you can't say it better than Merleau-Ponty himself says it here. Yeah, absolutely present beings who have a wake of the negative. A perceiving body that I see is also a certain absence that is hollowed out and tactfully dealt with. And I think his claim would just be here that, speaking in terms of ontology, in terms of the study of being, that absence or that negative does not imply this second order of being that we would call mind, right? Yeah. It's a hollowing out of materiality itself rather than rather than some negative indication that we need to be talking about this realm of the body or materiality and then positing this second layer of mind.
Yeah, and so there wouldn't be, like, the negative wouldn't be an abyss or a cut between you and I that we can never overcome and we're forever distant from one another. One of the ways in which that negative or that space and spacing between us is described in later works by Merleau-Ponty is as a fold. Yeah. Right? So we're all part of this intercorporeal flesh, and it's just simply that the flesh folds, giving rise to Ellie, or giving rise to David, but we're ultimately connected at an ontological level by this self-sensing intercorporeality that he will call the flesh. Yeah,
especially in his later work, the flesh and the visible and the invisible.
The visible and the invisible, which
articulates that.
Comes after this article, I think by like 4 or 5 years or so.
I don't remember the dates, but it's his last unfinished work.
Yeah, and so it's important to emphasize that foldiness, or that, I want to say that origami character of our relationship to one another, because I think the category of origami is kind of good for thinking about Merleau-Ponty's ontology, because it means that the same substance is sort of folding upon itself to give rise to forms. The analogy doesn't work if you think about origami as something that can be unfolded completely, which is not the case with the flesh. But this also brings us to his notion of simultaneity, because he says the problem with philosophers is that we think of self, other, nature as if they are different layers of being, and as if they are given to us sort of chronologically. First, I am a self. Then I encounter other people. Then I come to know the natural world. And he uses the term simultaneity to say, no, self, other, and nature are given originally, primally, in a simultaneous fashion. And it's only later, through the advent of objectivizing and aesthetic reflection, that we come to separate them. And so philosophy has had things backwards. It has put a secondary what is in fact primary.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think your origami analogy also is nice because if you think about the folding back casts a little bit of a shadow.
Yes, yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah, we should end. We should end.
Well,
this is my end. This is my bid and an end point.
And I would just say that shadow is actually a pretty central concept of phenomenology for thinking about things that are given in perception, but that are not always given positively, right? We see horizons, we experience hidden sides. Totally. The world itself is filled with shadows, and that's true of the world of perception, but it's also true of the world of philosophy in terms of the shadows that we create in the act of philosophizing.
Yeah. Close this out.
So we are very thankful for your attention and for your interest. Please give like to this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Especially if you didn't mind how many times David said Husserl.
Yes, on an essay about Husserl.
I know, sorry.
And we also encourage
we got to the juicy stuff.
Yeah. But the framing I do think was important. Yeah. And we also encourage you and invite you to listen to our audio podcast where we talk about philosophy in connection to contemporary issues and everyday life.
Yeah, and check out this book if you haven't already.
Yeah, great book. Somewhat a little bit hard, I would say, technical, but very, very enjoyable. And also, if you want to support our project, you can do so by becoming a member of our Patreon community on patreon.com.
Thanks.